Ladies and gentlemen, shout out to Enrique on the synths. Thank you so much, Enrique, for that epic music. Gather round, class. Gather round. The class is starting soon. The professor is finishing his blunt as we speak. We have an exciting lecture. The second half of personality traits agreeableness. Very exciting. Highly exciting, one might say. If everyone could please gather around, the class will be starting soon. I smell the professor, okay? The wafting of the good kush flows through the room, okay? Now, the problem is my setup is all fucked up, so I'm gonna have to get this oriented here. Luckily, I can set it all up before transitioning. It's the power of studio mode in OBS. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's just settle in, okay? Smoke if you got them. While I set this shit up. Lecture will be... not that one. Will be lecture notes. Fuck me. Oh, here we go. Yeah, baby. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. I'm too good at this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm too good at this. That's wrong. That's correct. God. Oh my God. Ladies and gentlemen, look at this epic fucking setup. Actually, to be honest, this is like the most janky, you know, bum-ass looking, half my face. I don't even know if should my face fill half the frame? That seems excessive. All right, I already have an elongated head. Although I suppose with an elongated, I suppose it matches my head, so it actually reduces the emphasis. If it was a square, it'd be more obvious. That's fine. By the way, this is some prime advertising. I was going to get a Maori head statue right here. But we'll see. Maybe I'll put a Sleep Number remote here along with the mattress. I have been contacted by Sleep Number mattress. They're like, we really like what you have to say about Nick Fuentes. That's a lie. That's a joke. That's a comedy. Okay, Sleep Number does not endorse anything I have to say. Although they haven't condemned it as far as I know. All right, hold on here. What the fuck is going on? Let's get this shit set up. Let's get this show on the goddamn road. Ladies and gentlemen, okay. What is going on here? Where's the chat? Here we go. Here's the chat. This is what I do full time. Paul, I should talk to Liquid Zulu. I did talk to Liquid Zulu like 4 years ago. It's quite sad. I've reached out to Mentis Wave, and I've not gotten any response, probably because neoliberalism is weak. I reached out to Yaron Brooks, actually. They talked to Stitch and Adam recently. I'd love to talk to Yaron Brooks. Anyway, I saw someone said CJ would put me in a miniskirt. Probably. I'm a big fan of non-binaryism. I'm non-binary. Indica or sativa? Epic question. To be honest, I've never noticed a difference. I don't actually believe there's a difference. That's my hot take. Ladies and gentlemen, the professor's walked in. Please keep all questions relevant to the lecture. And then afterwards, at the end, we'll do open Q&A. We can talk about anything. We can ask about anything. But let's get started. The professor is hyped and ready to fucking rumble. 47:49 is where we left off. Oh my God. Is it just me? Or are other people having this problem on YouTube? Where you have to, you can't change the speed of the video unless you refresh the fucking thing.
Make Control
R. So now I'll refresh it. And now I can adjust the playback speed. Does anyone else have that issue, or is that just me? It's really annoying.
Let's say resistance to change is predicated on the idea that the conservative
Oh, do we have desktop audio? Yes, we should have desktop audio.
inclination to support the maintenance of already existing structures is precisely equivalent to supporting an unjust system. And that's not a reasonable thing to do if you're looking at these sorts of things from a scientific perspective. You don't get to make judgments like that, but they're built into the questionnaires. So resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. These two dimensions appear roughly aligned with social and economic conservatism as expressed in the constructs of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, respectively. There is no left-wing authoritarian psychological scales. We're trying to derive one right now. But the reason for that is that after World War II, the social science community was responding to what had happened in Nazi Germany, and perfectly appropriately, and they examined right-wing authoritarianism as a consequence, but they never examined left-wing authoritarianism because the prevailing, what would you call it, political landscape of the time made the idea that there could be left-wing authoritarianism sufficiently incorrect politically so that it was never analyzed from the perspective of social science, even though the...
Okay. What the fuck? The video I'm working on now is about the post-World War II consensus, for those who are familiar. And that is about the most... We're adding that to the video now, because holy shit, that's the most dead relevant example of the post-World War II consensus in action. Left-wing totalitarianism was never studied because we were too focused on right-wing totalitarianism, hence the leftward lurching of history. Incredible. It's going straight into the video.
Evidence for left-wing authoritarianism, say, by the end of the 1940s was absolutely overwhelming, right? By the 1930s, people were reporting on what had happened in the Soviet Union, you know, the forced dekulakization, for example, of the agricultural industry in the Soviet Union and the consequent deaths of several million people in the Ukraine. It was all extraordinarily well documented. These core facets of conservatism are also closely related to the two higher order value dimensions described in moral foundations theory, which reflect preferences for order and tradition on the one hand and preferences for egalitarianism on the other. Importantly, the motivational basis of these two dimensions appears to vary independently from one another, with an individual's overall political attitudes on a left-right spectrum emerging from their relative balance. These motives are also strongly rooted in basic personality characteristics such that preferences for order and tradition are associated with higher levels of orderliness. Now, you might think that's obvious, right? Well, obviously, orderliness is associated with preference for order. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you can measure it, right? That's the issue. So these things seem self-evident, but it's taken a very long time to build up the instruments that allow them to be measured in such a way that you can also start to look at the correlates and the underlying psychophysiology. So it's by no means obvious. Higher levels of orderliness, an aspect of conscientiousness, and politeness, an aspect of agreeableness, as well as lower levels of openness and intellect. In contrast, preferences for egalitarianism are uniquely associated with compassion, an aspect of agreeableness. So, and that's exactly what we found when...
For those who are just jumping in and missed last week, I know we're kind of in the middle of this. I probably should have prefaced it a bit more, but we're doing, it's psychometrics, right? We're breaking down the components of the Big Five personality model, and we're getting the details here. But I think it'll start to, you know, once we get in flow, it'll come together a little bit better.
When we were looking at political correctness, which is primarily predicted not by openness or by conscientiousness, but by agreeableness. Political conservatism can therefore be thought of as a social immune system, reflecting the extension of pathogen avoidance mechanisms to the integrity of the social system. Borders, boundaries, right? That's the orderly person. We'll keep borders between concepts. We'll keep borders between people. We'll keep borders between towns. We'll keep borders between political ideas and religions and states. Why? Because we don't want the terrible things flooding in from everywhere. Now, the liberal will say, wait a minute, all the things flooding in from everywhere aren't terrible. They have great utility, and that's true. But the problem is, they're both true. They're both true at the same time, because, well, and we'll document that as we move forward. So then the question is, well, how do you know when things should be more open and when things should be more closed? And the answer to that is, well, you better have a chat with everyone and find out what they think, because it's a balance of probabilities. There's no way of determining it a priori. It's a balance of probabilities. And so you have to have a discussion to determine how wide the gates should be open and how narrow they should be closed. And that's also going to depend on the circumstances and the situation. So there's no way of, this is the thing that's so terrible about this. There's no way of determining a priori whose position is correct. Just as the behavioral, yes, in particular, the social immune system would help to maintain order by suppressing any actions or individuals that deviate from a group's accepted social traditions. It has been reported, for example, that regions with higher levels of disease prevalence tend to be associated with higher levels of social conformity and autocratic rule. Individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease likewise report higher levels of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Such basic concerns about pathogen avoidance may thus contribute to the desire for order and tradition among conservatives, along with the harsh moral judgments associated with violations of the social order. How do you purify something? How about with fire? That's something to keep in mind as we move towards the more political expressions of this. And the thing about something that's disgusting is you don't isolate it, exactly. You destroy it, right? It's the thing you do with rats and insects.
This is important. It's not fear, it's disgust.
X, for example, is destroy them, right? And you do that with poison, you do it with fire, you do it by cleaning things up, and you do that because, well, the rats will eat all your crops, and the insects carry disease, and all of that. So, or they infest your food, which you know, I don't know what proportion of today's food production is eaten by rats and insects, but it's a huge proportion still. According to the parasite stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Now, who the hell would have ever guessed that? Hey, this is where you see the real utility of a genuine social science, because it's by no means self-evident, this hypothesis. And this paper that I'm going to discuss with you right now just blew me away when I read it. I thought it should have been front-page news across the world, but it didn't really attract that much attention. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are inferential limitations associated with that evidence. We report 2 studies that address some of the limitations and provide further tests of the hypothesis. Study 1 revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. So that's very interesting. So the more parasitic and transmissible diseases in a particular locale, the higher the probability that people, when measured at the individual level, held authoritarian attitudes. Because you might say, well, there's parasite prevalence, that produces a repressive government, but it doesn't really affect people at the level of personality, and that's not what was found in the studies. It was reversed. The parasite prevalence / infectious diseases made people more authoritarian, and that was what was driving the more authoritarian government. So here's something cool. Who knows about this, right? So how do you fight authoritarian governments across the world? You get rid of infectious disease. That could be it. That could be the key. So, and then again, that is by no means a self-evident hypothesis.
How do you stop Trump and authoritarian Republicans? You destroy the woke mind virus that they're reacting to. Again, this goes back to what we talked about last week. If this is true, why were conservatives the ones during COVID to be saying, let's get out of the protests and all that, right? Or excuse me, let's get out of the lockdowns. You would think conservatives would be more inclined to do the lockdowns. And again, people forget, time blends together. At the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was on the same page. Let's all lock things down and wipe down packages and all that. You know, a year or so in, things shifted when people realized, A, the disease was not as bad, and conservatives were convinced that the woke mind virus was a greater threat than the actual virus. And so it's like, again, you know, we use the same part of our brains to detect predators as we do social phenomenon. We use the same part of our brains to register like actual disease with social diseases. And the whole Trump phenomenon is reacting to the woke mind virus. So if you want to reduce authoritarianism, if you want to reduce the likelihood that Trump comes around, get rid of the cause, which is wokeness. However we can blame the left, we're going to do. That's ridiculous, Paul. Well, the right is called reactionary for a reason. They react to things.
Study 1 that revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. And this effect statistically mediated the relationship between parasite prevalence and authoritarian governance. Parasites, personality, authoritarian state. That's the causal pathway. This mediation result is inconsistent with alternative explanations for previous findings. To address further limitations associated with cross-national comparisons, Study 2 tested the parasite stress hypothesis on a sample of traditional small-scale societies. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Together, these results further...
What was that there? Sorry.
Human welfare.
Results reveal that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. That's interesting. Famine also predicted authoritarianism.
Okay. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Together, these results further substantiate the parasite stress hypothesis of authoritarianism and suggest that societal differences in authoritarian governance result in part from cultural differences in individuals' authoritarian personalities. Here's the effect sizes. So look, they're mind-boggling. So first, that's authoritarian governance. 1, pathogen prevalence. The correlation is 0.42. 0.42. Right? There's malnutrition. There's warfare. It's actually negatively correlated with warfare. Famine, 0.26. So if you square that, that's about 8% of the variance. That's about 16% of the variance. So those are walloping effect sizes, right? That effect size is about, so that's 16%. The typical effect size for a personality variable is about 0.2 to 0.3. So let's say 0.25. So that's about 7% of the variance. That's 16 to 17% of the variance. You almost never see a correlation of that size. So it's an absolutely remarkable piece of work. And it has all sorts of terrifying implications. So the question is now, why would you have such a powerful immune system, behavioral immune system, disgust system? Okay, so let's look at some little known facts about the history of North America. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but it's worth knowing. Okay, so what was the pre-Columbian population of the Americas? The answer is we don't really have any idea. The estimates vary from 10 million to 100 million, with an emerging consensus of 50 million. Well, it's halfway. Okay, we don't know. We could be out by one order of magnitude, but a fair number of people. So what happened to all the Native Americans? Well, that's easy. They all died. Why? Because when the Spaniards came, see, there was no diseases in the New World, except for maybe syphilis. There's some evidence that syphilis was transmitted back to Europe as a consequence of contact with North and South America. But there were almost no...
Centrism. We give the natives smallpox, they give us syphilis, it all works out.
No diseases in the Americas. And that's partly because there were no big cities, and also because even where there were, not compared to Europe, and also because where there were big cities in Europe, people lived close with animals, and there was lots of movement of disease pathogens back and forth between the animals and the human beings. And so lots of Europeans died as a consequence of that, like huge numbers of them, especially from diseases, say like smallpox or measles. But the Europeans built up a whopping immunity.
So the Europeans were eating bats and developed the immune system.
Immunity to all these diseases, including influenza, and then they came to the Americas with their diseases, and bang, it killed all the Native Americans. They figured 90% of them. So here's some of the statistics. What were the diseases that wiped them out? Influenza, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles, even chickenpox was deadly to the Native Americans. So from 1492 to 1650, there was a death toll of 90%. So, you know, when the Puritans landed in the U.S. at Plymouth Rock, that was a long time after the Spaniards had landed in the more southern areas, the Indians, the Native Americans there, they were desperate to see them because they didn't have enough people to take off their crops. They didn't have enough people left. Imagine 9 out of 10 people died. That's everyone, right? You're done at that point. And so there were 25 to 30 million people in Mexico before the arrival of Cortez. 50 years later, there were 3 million. So, and the Aboriginal population in Canada, estimates, this is accepted by the Canadian government, no one really knows, and the estimates do vary substantially. There might have been 500,000 people in Canada in 1450, and that decreased by 80% after contact with the Europeans. There's the population collapse in Mexico. 16th century population collapse in Mexico. So the 1545 and 1576 epidemics appear to have been hemorrhagic fevers caused by an indigenous viral agent and aggravated by unusual climatic conditions. The Mexican population did not recover to pre-Hispanic levels until the 20th century. Absolutely catastrophic consequences. So then you look at that and you think, well, is it really all that surprising that people have evolved extraordinarily powerful immune systems, disgust responses, and behavioral immune systems? I mean, this is no joke. It's absolutely catastrophic. So now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Hitler. So when I was sorting some of this stuff out, trying to...
I want to talk to you a little bit about Hitler. Oh.
Look at this disgust sensitivity literature, and then understanding finally that it was associated with orderliness, and that orderliness was associated with conservatism. I was also reading a book by Adolf Hitler, which was called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book, and Hitler had secretaries at his dinner tables from 1939 to 1942, and they basically took shorthand notes of what he said spontaneously. And so there's a book that you can buy called Hitler's Table Talk that is nothing but a presentation of his spontaneous utterances across that time period. Now, Hitler was a very strange person. He was very high in openness, surprisingly enough, but also extremely high in orderliness. At least that's what you can infer from reading the historical data. So he bathed 4 times a day, for example. He was also a great admirer of willpower, which is something that's also associated with conscientiousness and orderliness. So he was very proud of his ability to stand like this.
Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry. Whoop. Sorry. Nope. Whoop. Sorry. We'll block that out.
For 8 hours in the back of a car, and his ability to withstand, you know, what would you call them, trying circumstances by willpower alone. One of the most famous film documentaries that was made in the Nazi era was called Triumph of the Will, right? Triumph of Willpower. And that was by Leni Riefenstahl. I'm not saying that quite right. You can look at that on YouTube. It's a very interesting film. Horrifying film, but a very interesting one. Well, if you're wondering about orderliness, I mean, take a look at that, man. So that's
This is kind of related to Nick Fuentes' claim that order is a higher virtue than freedom. Excellent observation. Nick Fuentes, you know, honestly or otherwise, which is a completely open question, is capitalizing on the portion of the population that is wired to be high in orderliness, and hence saying order. But that doesn't mean it's objectively correct. It's just that he's reaching a significant portion of the population. Just like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were reaching one was reaching the agreeable end, and one was reaching the disagreeable end of the agreeableness spectrum. To say one was right and one was wrong isn't enough, or rather the approach.
Nuremberg, right? That was the biggest rally grounds ever made in human history, Nuremberg. And Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle. Look at how absolutely perfectly ordered that is. God only knows how many people there. Several 100,000, because they could all fit on the parade ground at the same time. All in absolutely perfect formation. Orderliness. Gone out of control. It's interesting because people think about Nazism as a descent into barbarity, right? But what it looks like is a disease of civilization. That's a whole different thing, because conscientiousness predicts success in complex industrial societies. And this is actually conscientiousness gone out of control on the orderly end of things. And why? Well, the World War I, that was plenty chaotic. And there was a huge famine after World War I, right? Spanish influenza killed more people than the war did. And it actually mutated in the trenches, because if people are packed close together, then viruses or other pathogens can be very deadly because you don't have to live very long to give it to her. If people are dispersed, then the virus or the bacteria can't afford to kill you as fast because then it dies too. And so if you pack people together, then you can breed unbelievably virulent forms of pathogens, infectious pathogens, and that's what happened in World War I. Packed all the men together in unsanitary conditions, poof, up came Spanish influenza, went all around the world after World War I and killed more people than the war. So, and after the war, after World War I, of course, Germany descended into utter chaos. And so what happens when you descend into chaos? And the answer is there's a corresponding call for order. And that was answered by Hitler and the National Socialists. And Hitler was very good at listening to the German population, and what they were demanding in a period of chaos was order. And so that was exactly what he decided to provide. Spectacles of order, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who was really high in openness and high in orderliness, right? Spectacles of order. And Hitler was also extremely interested in art, but he categorized art into like proper hygienic art and improper chaotic art, and he often would have art exhibits at the same time of the approved art that he approved of. So those were in the official museums, let's say. And then there would be a corresponding exhibit of degenerate art. And that was art that was associated with movements like Expressionism, for example, which has garish colors and it's very emotionally expressive. Hitler sort of preferred kind of eroticized Greco-Roman representations of heroic people. You know, that was the Nazi aesthetic, essentially. So there are some more examples of order, right? Look at that. Everything geometric, everything regular, the border's completely well defined. Everything here is squares, everyone's lined up perfectly, everything is uniform, right? Look at, there's pathways between the rows of people. This is again at Nuremberg. Perfect order. Along with his plans for the world capital Germania, Albert Speer, that was the Nazi architect, made the plans for the world's largest stadium, which was to be located on the Nuremberg rally grounds, derived from the Panathenaic Stadium of Athens. It would have offered 400,000 seats. It was to get the shape of a horseshoe, planned dimensions, 800 meters wide, 450 meters high, 100 meters, with a building area of 350,000 square meters. The laying of the foundation stone was on 9th of July, 1937. It was to be finished for the Party Congress of 1945. In 38, the construction began with the excavation. It was stopped in 39, but during the whole war, the casting pit had to be kept dry from entering groundwater. After the war, the northern half of the pit filled up with water and is today called Silver Sea, Silver Lake. The southern half was used to deposit the debris of the destroyed downtown Nuremberg. That's Nuremberg at night. So what Hitler did, because he was very good at using fire and light as display as well. So that curtain there, so you see there's the Nuremberg buildings that we saw in the last photograph. Those are the searchlights from the Nazi Air Force. So they had them arrayed all the way around the grounds there and pointed straight up so that the nighttime rallies were illuminated by a cube of light. Very effective, artistic display of orderliness. Now, here's where things get seriously ugly. So this is a pamphlet from, I think, 1944. And the pamphlet is called Jew as World Parasite. So this is something I found on the net. I'll share it with you. Very rare original late 1944 anti-Jewish Third Reich pamphlet. This very scarce 6 by 8 3/4, 20-page softcover booklet by M.L. Reifer and Erich Schwartzberg was published 1944 in Frankfurt. It was published at a time when a great percentage of the European Jews had already been deported to concentration camps in the East, perhaps to justify what had happened to the Jews since the Nazi seizure of power. The authors compare the Jews with parasites, the most unpleasant forms of life on earth, and that it is only natural and justified against them to free humanity of them for the sake and survival of mankind. This is from the pamphlet. The people of the world will recognize the Jew as world parasite, and there will be a time when there will be one united front of all people against the Jewish world parasite. The pamphlet ends, and humanity will be freed from the most severe illness from which it suffered from thousands of years. Here's what happened in Nazi Germany. So when Hitler came to power, he was very interested in public health campaigns. And so he formulated a number of policies, including formulating these vans that went around screening people for tuberculosis. At the same time, he announced a policy to beautify and purify Germany. And so he encouraged the factory owners to clean up the factories, to get rid of the rats and the insects, and to plant flowers and so forth in front, right? So it was cleanliness and beauty. They used Zyklon B as the agent for disinfecting the factories. Zyklon B was the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So Hitler started out by getting rid of the rats and the parasites and the insects in Germany, along with his public health campaign. Then he moved into the insane asylums and started a euthanasia campaign. And then he moved outside into the broader political sphere and started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust. And so I'm going to show you some of the propaganda that did that so that you know how this sort of thing works. Okay, so this is from Richard Koenigsberg, who wrote a book called Hitler's Ideology, Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History. So we've already sort of discussed the idea. This is sort of an archetypal idea grounded in biology, you know, that you're run in some sense on this underlying biological platform of deeply rooted hypothalamic systems and amygdalic systems and so forth, and that you're a collection of those underlying systems organized at some higher order level. Well, those underlying systems manifest themselves in fantasy. So for example, if you're hungry, you're going to get a fantasy about going to get something to eat. And if you're lonely, you're going to get a fantasy about someone that you'd like to be with, and so forth, because the fantasy is part of the manner in which these underlying biological motivation systems think. Okay, so what do you think? How do you think and talk if you're possessed by disgust? Okay, The state did, these are from Hitler's utterances. The state did not possess the power to master the disease. The menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. The masses feel that the mere fact of the Jews' existence is as bad as the plague. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body saw at most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. At the time of the unification, the inner decay was already in full swing, and the general situation was deteriorating from year to year. The nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. It's all disease metaphor. It's all disease metaphor. The symptoms of decay of the pre-war period can be reduced to racial causes. Anyone who wants to cure this era, which is inwardly sick and rotten, must first of all summon up the courage to make clear the causes of the disease. They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer through a policy of...
And of course, the left-wing rhetoric around the parasite class, rich landlords, capitalists being parasites, it's the same underlying disgust mechanism, just a different manifestation of it, right? Just like environmentalists have a disgust mechanism. Toxic sludge in the water, poisoning the environment. That's the kind of stuff that motivates. So humans are the same. People have different spectrums of inherent personality tinkering, but you can, it's not a matter of some people are more disgust sensitive than others, but you can tell a narrative that latches on to any of these fundamental motivation systems from any direction.
Moderation. The Jew must take care that the plague does not die. If this battle should not come, Germany would decay and at best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. You can see in the right today an example of mortal decay. That is not the speech of someone who's possessed by anxiety. That's the speech of someone who's possessed by disgust. They're not the same thing.
Not the same thing. There's a clip of Matt Walsh saying, this is like the whole idea of phobia. I'm not homophobic, I'm not transphobic. When people say that, I'm disgusted by it. It's like, not fear, disgust. And disgust is worse in terms of the reaction to it. And Trump calling people parasites and left-wing vermin, it's like, it's not good. That's the language of disgust, which precedes the worst things ever.
The 1st of May can only be the liberation of the nation's spirit from the infection of internationalism, the restoration to health of peoples. Against the infection of materialism, against the Jewish pestilence, we must hold aloft a flaming ideal, another purification metaphor. The restoration to health of our people must start from the restoration to health of the body politic. So that was Hitler's essential metaphor. The nation was a body, right? It was a pure body. It was a pure Aryan body. And it was being assaulted by parasites that were subjecting it to disease and decay. That's the fundamental metaphor at the bottom of his political message. I gave the order to burn down to the raw flesh, Jesus, the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells. Yeah, pretty rough, man. This is the battle against a veritable world.
Is YouTube going to flag me for this shit? I think we get this.
Called the national body is being consumed. And you can look here at the what would you call it, artistic and propagandistic transformation of the idea of order into a politicized message. And the thing that's so interesting about Hitler's particular brand of fascism, it wasn't precisely it wasn't precisely a movement that was predicated on ideas, like communism. Communism was predicated on ideas, but the Nazis went at it with something that wasn't really in the realm of idea. It was more in the realm of like embodied disgust and image. And so it was also very much more difficult to fight against from the ideational perspective. It wasn't a well-developed intellectual movement. It was an embodied movement, and Hitler was extraordinarily good at using the metaphors and the images, and then his incredible capacity for propagandistic display to fire people up at a level of analysis that they weren't really even aware of. So let's take a look at this film.
Okay, this is the propaganda film. I don't want to get flagged, so we may have to skip it. Here's what I'll do. If people want to watch it, I'll put the timestamp in right now in the chat. But I'm not fucking with YouTube's thing anymore, so fuck this. Timestamp to propaganda video. So I'll pin that. People can watch it afterwards, but we're going to skip it. We're going to skip it. I don't trust YouTube on anything now. It actually pisses me off a lot.
You see the juxtaposition of order versus chaos. And so part of the order versus chaos archetype obviously is rooted in the dichotomy between disgust and purity. It's not the only it's not the only axis of opposition between order and chaos. And then, so this is all the invocation of archetypal chaos, and it starts with the use of the disease imagery, and then also the use of music composed in a minor key and threatening and low, right? So that's all juxtaposed together. And then they switch to trade, again with this undertone of threat, and there's a hand-to-hand exchange of goods, and it seems to me that they're using the image to continue the metaphor that in this situation, trade is associated with contamination rather than with productivity, right? And so you can see obviously a dichotomy with regards to trade, because when you're taking goods from someone else, the question is, are the goods of high quality and useful, and are they useful? Are they something that is going to introduce a foreign element or an unexpected element into your house? And so this film is obviously taking that ambivalence that's associated with trade and placing it into the chaos order archetype and then associating it with disgust. So it's very, very sneaky. And it's not done, it's done by inference rather than or an goods of high quality. So that's all juxtaposed together. And then they switch to trade, again with this undertone of threat, and there's a hand-to-hand exchange of goods. And it seems to me that they're using the image to continue the metaphor that in this situation, trade is associated with contamination. By inference rather than directly, which I think is a much more powerful way of doing this sort of thing. So in the next part of the film, there's something else that's done implicitly. So you'll see a globe, and then there's spread of migration, and the underlying metaphor there is, again, the spread of disease.
Peoples because they need the...
Welcome to YouTube censorship.
It's funny there's an echo of Marxist ideology in there too that's very interesting, because what the insistence is that very interesting because what the insistence is that the
Who the fuck is showing up late? Where's Enrique?
labor that goes into basic production qualifies as labor, but the labor that goes into mercantile activity doesn't qualify as labor at all. It's not like the Nazis were pro-capitalist by any stretch of the imagination. So there's this strange distinction drawn between, like it's almost like physical production, that seems to be something that's valued. It's the use of your musculature, say. But then as soon as it's elevated up into trade, which is obviously a value-added process, I mean, that's almost self-evident, but it's put forward here as something that's only parasitical. That's right. And that's a commonality with the Marxism of the time.
Are in the Russian sections of Eastern Europe.
So, well, let's tie that together. We talked about the use of archetypes in stories. We talked about the relationship between archetypal symbolism and the biological underpinnings of the human psyche. And then you can see that manifesting itself in this sort of propaganda and the political positions that come out of it. You tap into the archetypal dimension. That's chaos versus order. You can place one against the other however you want from a propagandistic perspective, because you could make a film decrying excessive order. That's not a difficult thing to do, but that isn't what happens here. Order is associated with the sun and with what's good and with honest labor and with purity and with health, and chaos is associated with decay and disgust and impurity, and also with trade, which is extremely interesting. And the trade dynamic, you can see that in the second part of the film there. There was the implication that it was involvement in trade that was associated with this pathological spread, right? And so trade, that's another reflection of the ambivalence towards the transgression of borders. Is trade a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, that's always a political issue. It's a huge political issue right now, right? You're going to have internationalist trade, or you're going to close the borders. You're going to have internationalist trade and open it, or you're going to close the borders. And so the degree to which the border should be open or closed, I think, generally speaking, is the prime political question. And of course, we're going through an absolute convulsion of that sort of argumentation again right now. Part of the reason I wanted to show you this, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. I wanted to show you how the archetype and the underlying biology are tightly associated. But I also wanted to show you how those associations can be hijacked, essentially, and used for propagandistic and political purposes, because you need to know that, because these sorts of things have they have the capacity for a very powerful emotional appeal. And the only possible way of resisting that, I would say, and avoiding the temptation of allowing extraordinarily complex issues to be catastrophically reduced to principles that are far too simple to do them justice, is to become at least aware to some degree of what the mechanisms for the production of such propaganda are and why they have such potency. Then you have at least some ghost of a chance of reducing your own, what would you call it, proclivity. We could even call it a temperamental proclivity to the kind of propagandistic information that happens to suit your temperament best. So, well, we all know the aftermath of this sort of thing, right? It was absolutely dreadful. And we're by no means out of the woods on that yet. You know, you see in Europe and in the United States, increasingly calls for the nationalistic enclosure of borders again. You saw that with Trump and the building of the wall between Mexico and the United States. So these things can get very badly out of hand, and it's a very bad idea to allow things to swing too far to one way or too far to the other, because all hell breaks loose when you do that. And, well, all right, we'll see you on Thursday.
And only the dark centrists can keep the balance where it must be. Well, everyone, that was the shortest lecture that we're ever going to do because we had to cut most of it out because YouTube is run by the... Jesus Christ. Well, interesting. I mean, it speaks to the degree to which... we got some time, so let's run to the Richard Dawkins, Brett Weinstein debate.
First of all,
and let's go to the related section here. Oh, this shit's in Arabic. I don't know why ping burn videos default to Arabic. What am I doing here? Genocide. Okay. Let's watch this. This is related, to the lecture we just watched. This is Brett Weinstein independently converging on this idea.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let's just see where it is that we disagree. My claim is that if it is true, and I obviously can't say if it is or it isn't, but if it is true that things like xenophobia, genocide, suicide are products of adaptive evolution, that in order to address these things going forward in a useful way, understanding their nature is likely to be beyond helpful and may even be essential. So to give one example, let's say that the impulse to genocide is something that lurks inside human beings, awaiting certain indicators that it is the moment for that program to be triggered.
Okay, so the idea is we have discussed sensitivity within us. The desire to burn. Essentially, genocide is a over or hyper reaction of the behavioral immune system. So correct me if I'm wrong. I think a fever that kills you is a result of your own immune system killing you. Right? A fever is your own immune system working in overdrive, and then it exhausts you and kills you. I think that's vaguely right. There's diseases like that if that's not exactly right. So genocide, but you can see there's an adaptive reason we have the ability to put ourselves in a fever because it does actually cure, clean out the disease. Genocide is essentially a hyper reaction of the behavioral immune system. But the fact that it exists at all means that the behavioral immune system obviously has adaptive value. So the theory is, Richard Dawkins claims that genocide and all that, this is just an entirely mimetic cultural thing. There's no evidence of it genetically. Brett Weinstein is saying, no, it's wired within us. And we have to acknowledge that so then we can look out in the world and be like, let's make sure that the program to genocide never activates, which I think is correct. It aligns with what Peterson is saying, is that it's inherent. And people fucking shit on Brett Weinstein for even suggesting that there could be a biological basis for genocide. But let's keep going here.
Were that the case, you would want people to engage that question ahead of time when they were in possession of their full faculties and to recognize that they might have a program within them that violates the values that they believe are their guide.
Yes, but I think I would prefer to say that these impulses are byproducts of something primitive and evolved. So something like genocide. We know that chimpanzees, for example, do practice genocide against rival groups of chimpanzees. One can make a genetic evolution case that says something like this. In our wild ancestry, using the Hamilton idea of living in villages, living in small bands, the companions that you know, that are familiar to you from day to day, everybody you know is a relative, strangers are not. And so killing strangers, genocide, killing neighboring bands of people like happens in some parts of the New Guinea highlands, for example, that could be regarded as a byproduct of genetic natural selection. And something like the Nazi atrocities could be regarded as a manifestation of that genetically evolved tendency. But it's in a totally different context. And of course, I agree with you that we need to resist, we need to rebel against the selfish genes. But I prefer not to talk about the things that we do in our modern society in a sort of straightforward biological way, but rather to say these are relics, byproduct relics of our genetic past. And one can do this all the time, and I think that we do it a lot. We do things like...
Yeah, so Brett is saying, no, genocide is an adaptive, like evolution selected for it. And Dawkins is saying, no, it's like a side product, right? Like it's like it's a misfiring of something that existed as adaptive in a different context.
The desire for business executives to have a big...
Which is very interesting. This whole debate, by the way, is like, I've watched this at least 3 times, twice high. No, 4 times, twice high. This debate is foundational in a lot of my thinking. I would recommend it, by the way.
thicker office carpet, that kind of thing. This is all... you can interpret that in a sort of biological way as representing something like something that came from our biological past. But you have to be very careful when you do it. And I think it's very often not very helpful to try to apply Darwinian ideas directly to the sorts of things that we get in modern society, whether it's horrible mechanized warfare or executives demanding bigger desks or whatever it is. I just think we've got to be very careful in applying. And I am in favor of evolutionary psychologists who do this kind of thing, but I think they do it in a careful way. And I think we've got to be very cautious in the way we do it.
Well, you and I are in 100% agreement that we need to be extremely careful in applying evolutionary logic, and it is possible to get carried away. I, for example, would not argue that we can apply evolutionary logic to anything so new that we don't know if it stands the test of time. Right? So,
social media.
I have a test of adaptation that just simply tells you whether or not you are on solid ground to presume that something is adaptive, and it involves looking at whether something has a complexity, whether it has a cost, a variable cost that could be reduced, and whether it persists over evolutionary time. So wanting a bigger desk is, I think you and I would agree, certainly a manifestation of something evolved, but it's very hard to analyze desks with Darwinian tools because desks are new. But something like genocide is not new. Warfare is not new. And so these things are complex, expensive. We're seeing a history that goes into antiquity and beyond, and that, I believe, not only gives us license to apply Darwinian tools, but I would say, A, it is the most parsimonious explanation, and B, it is our best hope of ending these patterns permanently. If I didn't believe that, I would be much less enthusiastic about what is revealed by these analyses. I would say they are justified, but I might not be a champion of doing it, and I might not be so interested in doing it personally. But
people have posted clips of this on Twitter, and they're like, fuck Brett Weinstein, he's a genocide. I'm like, what do you fucking... People need to wake up. All right, everyone. We are now in the open Q&A section. Thank you for joining this lecture. It's been very exciting. If anyone has any questions about anything at all, feel free to post it now. Linguistic, did you post the thing in the stream reaction content? Someone said a meme to share. Oh, nice. The FYI, for those in the book club, the Ted Kaczynski Manifesto, the audiobook was just posted. So, anyway. Another snooze Peterson live. Shut up, Justin. I'm mad at Brett about his vaccine stuff, but that doesn't stop me from giving him credit for his clearly gay thinking on other topics. You know what? What a utterly reasonable perspective. When someone calls me racist, can I reply, I evolve this way? You could, but it's sort of like if someone calls you a... yeah, never mind. I was going to go somewhere terrible with that, but we should just not be racist. We're all children of God. Imago Dei. Image of God. Let's not be racist, okay? Let's not be racist. Okay, let's clean this up. I'll create the next lecture, by the way. I need to save this. The next video I'm doing is, like I said, on the post-World War II consensus, which is kind of a foundational idea that I haven't expanded enough upon. And I need to do that. But let's get next week's lecture down. And if, where are we? And if people don't have any questions, then we can wrap it the fuck up. What's the next one on? This is 22. The next one will be We just did orderliness discussed. Performance prediction. The best prediction of performance is, do I have a blue chew on me? All right. That will be for next week. Where are we at? Next week, December 10th at... Whoops. Public December 10th at 5 p.m. Yes. Yes. Very good. Very good. Ba, 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 ba. Okay. Let's get shareable link. Link to... Oh. Next week's lecture is linked there. If you want, you can click it, hit notify me, and we'll work on it. I see a super chat from Brian. That is greatly appreciated. When's the video coming out that you referenced? Also, has your perspective changed on the importance of religion and grounding morals? Are religious curious? When's the video coming out that you referenced? The post-World War II consensus video will probably come out, what day is today? Wednesday? I more or less have finished writing it. I have to create some visuals tonight. Tomorrow morning, I will film it and edit it, so it'll probably come out Friday. That would be ideal. What day is it? Wednesday? Jesus Christ. Time flies so much. Has my perspective changed on the importance of religion and grounding morals? Over my lifetime? Yes. No doubt. Religion is the domain of morality, by definition. You're just, how could you argue against religion, everyone being religious, if you just redefine religion? I don't give a fuck. I'm not trying to do this to argue. I'm trying to do this because I think I'm putting forward it as a definition, as a better definition. Because I think using the framework we have for religion helps us better understand morality in a clearer sense. Okay? If someone is willing to kill someone of a rival sports team, we can say that the psychological significance of that person's sports team's symbol plays the same psychological role, has the same psychological effect, evokes the same physiological responses as a devout Christian or Muslim. But thank you for the question, Brian. I very much appreciate it. Sorry, I see some other ones here. We've been seeing the cultural pendulum swing back to the right for a few months now. When do you think it's going to stop? That's the golden question. I don't know. Is the book club just starting this book, or should I start on the next one? The book club will be, because the Ted Kaczynski manifesto is a short one. Looks like it's a 2.5-hour audiobook. You can probably read it in an hour if you're a quick reader. We'll be covering that tomorrow, and then afterward we'll be deciding what the next book we read is. The book club is every Thursday night at 7 p.m. It's optional. If you join the Patreon and you join the Discord, you can assign yourself the book club role. And then we do the book club. And they've been fun. They've been productive. What else do we have here? On my own generational run. Thanks, Justin. Enough glaze. Enjoy the snooze. Okay. Unbelievable. Utilitarian Christian arc over. Yes. Hulk, who are you? Why am I subscribed to you? Are you a political channel? If so, right-wing or left-wing? How in God's name can I answer those questions? Why are you subscribed to me? Bitch, I don't know. One might say I am the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega. No blasphemy on this channel. No blasphemy. Hulk Hobbs, you can find out who I am. Just watch some of my videos. You'll see a very clear pattern. The pendulum is already swinging back to the left with Zohran. Actually, I think what's happening is we are polarizing. That's what I think is happening. was meant to be. Listen, new rule, no trolling. No, my own comments cannot be trolling me. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. Sean, the chat is blocking you again. Listen, Sean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, okay? But something tells me that I may have talked about Israel for a little bit too much on certain topics. Shoot it to me over Discord. Would I interview E. Michael Jones? On Rumble, maybe. If I interviewed Nick Fuentes, I'd have to put it on Rumble. And then what I'd probably do is I would take clips that I thought were YouTube safe and put them on YouTube. We're filing for political EBT soon. Okay. I won't ask questions. I swear I'm not a troll. I just don't know who you are and found out I was subbed to you. Listen, Hulk, no problem. My life is a joke, okay? Just censor the entire interview except you talking. That's actually not a bad idea. Anyway. All right, everyone. Well, that was a quick lecture. Apologies that we had to cut down the interesting parts. But we'll get to a next thing. This is the question from Sean. Why did you lie about the hair products that you used? We all know that you use salt-based pomade created from leftist tears, kosher Mossad mousse, and goop hairspray from the capitalist Gwyneth Paltrow. That's not funny. That's disgusting. Listen, you can make jokes all you want about anything. You joke about my hair, we've got beef. Okay. Goop hairspray from that all caps capitalist Gwyneth Paltrow. Listen, it is Hans DeFucco. It's actually, I think it's Hans DeFuco, but I like saying Hans DeFucco. Anyway. There's going to be a split between the middle left and right versus the far right and far left. There will be an alliance between the middle left and middle right and far left and far right to take. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. It all depends on which individuals can form coalitions. Have that one Chinese song, Sunshine, Rainbow, White Pony. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Nice to get the notification just now. Listen, I unlist these, but I don't private these. And the playlist is always available. If you go to the playlist tab of my YouTube channel, you can find all these. The only thing that is beef is JBP's dinner table. That's for sure. Hope you had a good day, Johnny Bravo. I appreciate it, Jordan. All right, everyone, let's wrap this shit up. I'm going to get back to work. Surprisingly short lecture. But we must operate in the way that we do. Sending you Gerard Chakra so your IQ gets higher. I appreciate that. I need it to be higher. When I inevitably debate Coleman Hughes, I'm going to need to be higher. Why not a coalition between the mid-left and far left? Because that would just be left. And that's lame. Anyway, all right. Godspeed, everyone. I appreciate it. Gotta roll. Peace on earth. How do I exit out of this? There we go. Peace.